there weren't enough people talking about how civilization is inherently unsustainable. Like I saw some writers who were pretty outraged. There were some female writers who were really outraged about what was happening to women. There were some black writers who were outraged about what was happening to black people. There were American Indian writers outraged about what happens to American Indians. I didn't see any, most of the nature writers were pretty, oh, nature's so beautiful. But none of them are like, damn it, these salmon need to be not driven extinct. We need to stop them from being driven extinct. And I didn't see anybody with that fire. It's like, I can do it.
Derrick Jensen, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I've been following your work for a number of years and always appreciated your writing and when I listen to you in interviews. Um, I shared a recent interview that you'd done that got quite a number of views. I shared it with my wife, who's an astrologer, and she wasn't familiar with your work before, but she was compelled by what you were speaking about to look up your astrological chart. She's a professional astrologer. And she noted that you are, like me, a Sagittarius. And also, like me, you have Sagittarius in your Mercury, which is, I guess, the placement of communication and things like that. And we were just kind of talking last night over dinner, and I was telling her I was going to interview you today. And she was mentioning this and saying, one of your traits, I think, like Derek's, is that you tend to speak your mind in a way that's unfiltered, and that can get you in some trouble, but it can also be like a medicine for the world. It can be the thing that isn't being said, that people are actually wanting to hear, or that needs to be heard. I don't know. Does this resonate with your experience at all?
Um, yeah, I mean that I've one of the reasons that I started writing the books that I did is that when I was a baby activist back in the 80s and 90s, late 80s, early 90s, I I saw a lot of environmentalists were in private talking about the fact that civilization is inherently unsustainable. But in public, they would say, no, no, we're just trying to stop this timber sale. And they could never talk about the larger framework. And I got really fascinated between that dissonance between the public and private discourse. And then also, before I wrote A Language Older Than Words, which was my first big book, um, it was originally supposed to be about interspecies communication. And I would ask people if they'd ever had a conversation with some non-human, whether it's a dog or cat friend or a plant or anything. And so many people said to me, um, yes, but I've never told anybody before because it's so embarrassing to say, that I've had a conversation with a dog or I had this profound, like this is a small thing, but it's very interesting that I'll tell a small thing and a big thing. A small thing was one day I was walking through the forest here and this dog came up and started walking next to me. And it was clearly like half wolf, half dog. It was not a regular dog. And I've had dogs just come up and walk next to me when I'm walking somewhere before. It's no big deal. But this one it was, I mean, like, this is why I say it's a small thing because it was, we only walked together for 50 feet or something, but it was profoundly different than walking next to a tame dog in that it was like a fully sovereign being or something. So we just had this little moment. Or a better example that's just also just kind of cosmic and strange is my mom had oh gosh, 10-year relationship with a bear outside. And then that bear, my mom called her mama. She would always bring her babies up and everything. Anyway, the bear disappeared. And that's the thing about wild nature is, was she dead? Did she go away? We had no idea. And we, thought about her for a few years. And then it's like, well, she's just gone. And then my mom got pancreatic cancer. And the last week, I'm not making any of this up, this is real. The last week before my mom entered terminal delirium, she's sitting right there on the couch and she looks out the window and it's like, and Mama is back. And then that bear sits on the porch for the next week, sits there all day, every day until my mom enters terminal delirium. And then she left. That was 5 years ago. And then the bear left and never came back. And the point here is that a lot of us have a lot of stories like this that we tell in private, but then we don't say them in public. And I never knew that part was Sagittarius. I thought it was just social ineptness that I don't know to keep my mouth shut on that stuff. So yes, that's interesting. Another thing about the astrology I find interesting that you didn't mention here, but I've always found fascinating is that Beethoven's a Sag, and I feel like I've been told that a lot of times Sagittarian, the table is shaking because the dog rolled over next to it. Anyway, the I've heard that a lot of Sagittarian uh, artists like to work on big paint, big canvases, and they like to make these sort of grand statements. Beethoven's a great example, and my books end up being pretty big and like making these sort of grand, sweeping statements. And then one more sad thing is
Mhm.
um, I am pretty terrified of commitment, and I've heard about Sagittarians that or Sagittariuses that. Uh, we will never make a decision today that we can put off till tomorrow. And that's true even on things like if you and I were going to go out to dinner and we would get in the car and then we wouldn't make the decision as to go to this restaurant or this restaurant until we actually get to the corner where we have to choose.
Mhm.
Um, so that's another classic Sag thing for me. I don't there's some others, but those are the ones I remember.
Mhm. Yeah, the thing you're talking about with the big canvas, I think it has to do with Sagittarius being ruled by Jupiter. So this planet of expansiveness. It's called in some systems, it's called like the guru planet. It's like all about the big picture thinking. So that kind of makes sense. And yeah, if two Sages are hanging out, there's not so much hang up about like, hey, we said we were going to do this. We'd both be like wanting to be spontaneous and in the moment. So that would work out okay, I think. Um, but
I was talking to a
yeah.
I was talking to a pretty famous Sagittarius writer one day. We when I found out she was Sag, the first thing I asked her was, "So, are you afraid of commitment?" And she looked at me like, "Are you my therapist? How did you know this? We don't know each other." And anyway, that's pretty interesting.
Well, if you know that about yourself and you know it's kind of a Sagittarian trait, then yeah, you kind of like have an insight into somebody or, at least enough to ask about it and see if it stands true. Um, yeah, well, there's a number of things that we could talk about because your work has really evolved over the years to get into different topics. But I guess like what was on my mind this morning when I was thinking about speaking with you is this book that you promised last year called The Boy in the Box and said it was forthcoming. And I don't think it's been published yet, has it?
No, that book is done, but I this is a problem with working with big canvases is okay, and digressing is that um I finished it about last August, and I haven't sent it to my agent yet to try for a publisher because there are two or three big chapters in the middle where it's a digression too far even for me. And so so the book itself is about um the effects of it's almost like part two of a language older than words, in that it's about abuse and about what abuse does to personal and social dynamics. And it it really started as a book with the working title of Stopping Rape Culture. And it's about men's violence against women. And in the middle, I go on a couple chapters where I attack postmodernism. And I can easily see the links, and I see how that fits with everything else. One of the points that I've made in several books is that I think we have an entire culture suffering from complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and a lot of our ideologies can be considered to be or can be seen as manifestations of PTSD, and that's all fine. And then I got um, this bug in my ear, or whatever the phrase is, about how postmodernism is a great example of that. And I have a really good chapter on postmodernism, but it doesn't really fit with the book. And so I've been, there's a famous line by some famous writer or another about you always have to kill your darlings.
Hmm.
And what he means by that is if there's something that doesn't fit in the book, you just need to be ruthless about cutting it out. And I've spent August, September, October, November, December, January, February, March, April. I've spent the last 8 months dithering as to uh, as to killing that particular darling, and I think I'm going to have to. I just so that's why that book isn't out. It's not like some big controversy, and it's not. I mean, I've had problems with getting canceled, but this is a this and this isn't a sad problem either, because it's not that I'm afraid of making the commitment. I do this all the time. It's just I'm trying to figure out if I take out the couple three chapters, what sort of bridge do I have to create? So it's that's why that book isn't out. But I'm happy to talk about that book if you want. I think it's one of the best things I've written.
Hmm.
I'm very happy with it. It's just I wish I wouldn't have gotten quite so. When I write, I'm kind of I feel, and I like this. I love this about my work, and I love this about doing the work. I feel like a puppy who is just running around exploring everything in a meadow, and that can be. I think when it works, I think it can be really charming, and when it doesn't work, it can be like, good grief, can you get back on topic, please? And this is a place where it's like, good grief, can you get back on topic?
Hmm. Yeah, I was wondering about that because, like, obviously you've written a lot about violence to the earth and to nature and, non-human beings and things like that. And this is kind of like bringing it down to the more personal human level of male violence against, children and women. Um, was that conscious in your part, or is that just like the puppy following whatever's interesting him in that moment as part of your own personal journey?
Is which part conscious? The
Moving
coming back to
moving
the
from
personal.
moving from the global to the personal. Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Like where you like, I want to tackle this next is like bringing it home to, the effect of violence on young people and women.
it's it's not quite so conscious as, okay, I need to, this is going to sort of bring back the 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 bring my work back some sort of full circle, or it's time for me. Well, it is time for me to address this, but it's more I get I was talking with an attorney once about her work, and she would take on one case at a time, and she would devote everything in her life to working on that case, and then when the case was over, she would move on. And she called that serial monogamy in terms of work. And I feel sort of the same thing, that I will get, completely taken up with the topic for a year, 2 years. And, the book I'm working on right now is about, I was my mom's sole caretaker as she was dying. And as I was going through that process with her, it was absolutely miserable. And I, at the time and since, have talked to so many people who have been sole caretakers of someone they love, and it has made it so they were not able to love the other person to death because they're too exhausted to they they they, they it's really not feasible. It was pretty famous back in the 90s. There was a book about it takes a village to raise a child. And the book I'm currently working on is about how it really takes a community to help someone die. And one person can't do it alone. And I did it alone, and it was not good for me, not good for my mom. And again, I've talked to so many people who are in the same thing. I was talking to a friend just the other day whose mother has advanced dementia, and she took care of her by herself took care of her mom for many, many years. And um, and before that, she took care of her father as he was dying. And uh, she uh, she found and a lot of nursing homes are really either really expensive or really terrible. And she found one. She's from another country, and she found one in that country that is actually quite wonderful for her mom. Mom doesn't even remember who she is, so she can't take care of her. And anyway, the point is that she was doing that for so many years that she got who she was. Basically, her 30s and 40s were spent taking care of first her father and then her mother. And she said to me a month ago, um, I guess her mom's been someplace else for been in the good nursing home for like a year. And she said, I still don't even know who I am. I don't know. I had a purpose in my life for many years. Anyway, so that's what I've been kind of obsessed about for the last year. And then when I finish this, um, I'm going to write a book about bears, and I'll be obsessed about that for a year. So it's. I used to see all my books as chapters of the same big book, and it's kind of true. Um, but I mean, that was a long non-answer to your question.
Hmm.
But I do think that the question of violence against women and children is a hugely important one. And the way I organized that book, which I think worked, is there's this book put out by Peggy Reeves Sanday in the 80s called Female Power and Male Dominance. And in there, she does a cross-cultural study of why some cultures are high rape and some are low rape. And I mean, the first off, there's the fact that there are some cultures that are low rate shoots down the idea that it's purely evolutionary or that it's inherent. And she wanted to find characteristics, and some of them are really obvious. Like if it's highly militarized, then it's probably a higher rate culture. And if it's higher, if men are given status and women are given less status, it's probably a high rate culture. And then there's some that are pretty fascinating, like if there is a male creator deity as opposed to a couple creator deity or female creator deity, it's probably high rate, which is pretty interesting because that was first mentioned to me by Judith Herman, the great writer who did Trauma and Recovery, when I interviewed her back in the 90s. And I was 35 or something at the time. And it had never occurred to me to question. When I'm interviewing her, she says, and that is kind of odd that you would have a male creator deity. Like that had never occurred to me. Like that is kind of odd. You can see a female because females give birth, and you can see a couple because couples procreate, but to have a male creator deity, and it never occurred to me. Anyway, so in the
Hmm.
book, I take each one of those characteristics and basically devote a chapter to it. And then, like I said, I get annoyed at postmodernism right in the middle.
Hmm.
To be fair, the reason I get annoyed at postmodernism is because I talk about one of the most harmful things in this culture, I think, is the great chain of being, which is where you have abstract thought at the top and embodiedness at the bottom. And so it's like God's at the top, and according to the old days, God's at the top, then angels, then humans, then animals, non-human animals, and then plants, and so on. And it's basically abstract mind is perfect, reality is not. And where postmodernism fits into that is that postmodernism really believes that there are only the stories we tell, and there's no underlying reality.
Hmm. So postmodernism. Hmm. Derek's just taking care of his dog right now. That's okay.
Yeah, so there's four dogs, and it's all fine. And then if one gets a little bit excited, then it's like, "We got what's going on?" Everybody gets very excited, and there was one of them basically rolled over, and that startled another one. And then anyway, so
So
that's
post
where postmodernism fits in.
right.
It's just too much. I really should reduce that chapter to a sentence.
So postmodern, like overvaluing the nous or the great mind or the intellect over everything else.
And also believing that the stories we tell are the important thing as opposed to the underlying reality. And then I tie that back. This is why I'm having trouble with it, because also it works because that is a part of what happens when we're traumatized too, is that we come to believe that your reality is so horrible when you are being abused that you create these stories that become more important than the physical reality.
Hmm.
Um what's the word? Oh shoot, what's the really, it's a common word. I can't believe I can't think this. You dissociate
Hmm.
and leave your body
Oh,
for up here, and it's called the boy in the box because early on, well, why don't I'll just, if you don't, I don't have to if you don't want, but I can read like the first page, which sets up everything,
yeah, sure.
um, and lets people know why it is a Bach, why that's the title. Uh, when I was a child, my father was extremely violent. He broke my sister's arm. My brother has epilepsy from blows to the head. He raped my mother, my sister, and me. None of us survived. Oh, we continued to breathe sometimes, the times, as shallowly as possible, so we could move as little as possible, so we could be as unnoticed and unnoticeable as possible. Continued sometimes to sit bolt upright, unmoving except for wide, unblinking eyes that jumped to any movement. Continued to eat, like the time my father leapt over the dinner table to get at my brother, and I continued to try to eat because that's what you do at the table and because I didn't want to be noticed. But did we survive? I don't know, because I don't know who we would have been without my father's teaching. But I know one thing. We each in our own way learn to persist. We learn to be mules, to be impervious to whatever happened. Oh, we'd break and we'd plead and we'd cry and we'd run, but somewhere inside each of us stood a mule who could and would take every blow and not give an inch. Or put another way, inside of each of us, or put another way, inside of each of us was a box into which we could climb, where we could not be touched. Like I said, none of us survived. I don't know what was inside my siblings' boxes. I've never asked. Inside of mine were stars and the irrigation ditch behind the house, and the meadows beyond that, full of meadowlarks, garter snakes, cottonwoods, grasses, grasshoppers, and ants. The boxes of some people are full of music, others are full of words, stories, books. Some are full of paintings, some are full of beautiful places, some are full of pets or other animals. Here's what I learned about boxes as a child. The box must be strong enough to withstand any amount of battering, yet small and light enough to be with you always. It must be constructed such that you can dive inside almost instantaneously, faster than a slap, certainly faster than a door quietly opening and shutting in the dark. And you need to train yourself to be able to find that entrance to the box no matter what else is going on. You need to be able to move instantly from deep sleep. Wait, sleep can be deep? Who knew? And dive into the box with no discernible transition from sleeping to waking. You need to be able to get into the box while you're running and dodging. You need to be able to get into the box while sitting on the couch watching someone else get beaten. Get in the box without moving a muscle. The box is transparent and permeable so that at every moment you can see and hear and feel everything. And I mean every slightest hint of movement, every slightest change in musculature that might indicate a change in mood that goes on outside the box. Your life depends on this. At the same time, the box must be completely opaque and impermeable, such that you're able to protect yourself from even the slightest awareness of what's happening to everyone, including yourself outside the box. Your life depends on that as well. The box must simultaneously allow you to perceive everything and to be aware of nothing.
Hmm. Yeah, it's really touching.
Thanks.
Yeah, I can relate. Particularly, I think what jumped out at me is the sleep can be deep. So that hypervigilance that happens when we grow up in a household that is threatening or unstable. Yeah.
Yeah, a sort of significant moment for me was um, when I had my first girlfriend when I was a teenager, and she came up one day to behind me. She snuck up behind me to tickle me, and when she touched me, I whirled around with my fists raised, and uh, I've never hit a woman. In fact, I haven't hit anybody since eighth grade. But she, the look of terror on her face when I whipped around ready to fight. was a moment for me when I was like, huh, maybe not everybody has this star response.
Mhm.
Maybe some people are not always ready to for fight or flight.
Mhm.
I mean, of course, I didn't articulate that at 17. I just, that was like I was just horrified at the time and thought about that for a long time afterwards.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, even with my wife, I had to tell her like, be careful about, you know, in like a fun, playful way, surprising me, because I might lash out. It's just the way my nervous system's wired because of how I grew up.
Yeah, yeah. It's
I don't know if that ever
I've seen
goes
it.
away either. I mean, I've done a lot of work and done a lot of like, you know, yoga, embodied practices, everything to kind of try to release some of these tensions in the body or reset the nervous system. But I don't know, I still sleep with earplugs in and still got to be careful about jumping out at me from behind a corner.
Yeah, well, how old are you?
I turned 50 this year.
Okay. Well, I'm 63 and I still sleep with a noisemaker. Um, and the noisemaker is because otherwise any smallest sound will pop me up. So uh,
Mhm.
yeah, and there are some things that have gotten better and some things
Mhm.
that uh, that I think I'm just stuck with for life. And well, stuck is one way to look at it. And the way I'm really proud of the last chapter of Boy in the Box. Don't worry, I'm not going to read the whole thing to you. Um, about how I realized that these some of the things are just kind of a okay. So when I wrote a language older than words, after I wrote that, some of my symptoms of PTSD got a lot better because I told the trauma story, and that helped. So I used to. I mean, it's really weird that until I was until I wrote that book, every night when I went to bed, I would check the closets and check under the bed, and I would bar the door. And I stopped, and also I would wake up 10 times a night in panic and in terror. And all of that stopped after I wrote the book, that part. And then there are other parts that are still intractable, like insomnia. And it's for me, it's really had to be sort of a serenity prayer thing that well, a couple things. One is that I sort of looked at them as uh, as as soldiers who were sent to help keep me alive when I was a kid. Those parts of me, like the hypervigilance, there are reasons for it. They make perfect
Mhm.
sense within the context of that situation. The hypervigilance, the not being able to sleep deeply, and some of them realized that, and I'm not talking like multiple personality stuff. It's just this really is a metaphor. That some of them realized that they could retire. They didn't have to be on guard all the time anymore. And others, like I said, are with me for life. And it's a serenity prayer thing that I can only I have to have some serenity about them and just live with them. And in some ways, they can be advantageous still. A few months ago, had to make a very quick trip from California to Colorado. And you want somebody to drive through the night? I'm your man.
Mhm.
So I just didn't sleep. I drove straight through. Absolutely no danger of falling asleep because I couldn't get to sleep. In fact, when I got there, it took me another 8 hours to get to sleep. And but in the meantime, sure, I'll drive through the night, no biggie.
Mhm.
Um, so there are some ways that, and I know, I mean, there are some ways. So I had 12 years of therapy when I was in my late 20s and early and all of my 30s. And one of the, if I had to like sum it all up into one thing, it would be uh, I really want to have a choice. It's not that I want to get rid of all of these characteristics. I want to choose when to manifest them.
Mhm.
So there are times, I don't know if this is true for you, but one of the things that happened when I was a kid is I learned to read people's musculature
Mhm.
really well. And so I can tell a lot of times before somebody else can tell that they're really mad or that
Mhm.
they can think they're not upset, but I can tell they are. And that, and of course I get false positives, I'm not always right.
Mhm.
And I get more false positives than false negatives, a lot more false positives than false negatives. But the point is that in the right circumstances, that can be a gift.
Mhm.
And so I've learned to the things that didn't go away, some of them like the insomnia can be a pain, but I've tried to also perceive them as gifts. I mean, it really is a gift to be able to read someone else's. I mean, I don't know if this has happened to you, but it's happened to me so many times where even in a situation where I'm not involved, I'll see two people and it's like I can kind of predict what's going to happen. The person on the left over here is going to escalate. And I can't tell you what it
Mhm.
is about their face or their stance, but I sure as heck learned to read it when I was a kid. Is this making sense to you?
Oh yeah, yeah. Yeah, like when you live in that kind of environment where there's might always be the threat of danger, you start to perceive all of these subtle cues. And yeah, it makes you really good at reading other people. And that can be used in a beneficial way. Like I do a lot of work with people, counseling them now. And I can pick up on all of these kind of subtle cues that I'm not thinking about it, but it comes through as like intuition. Um, it reminds
Yeah,
me of,
this person is saying that this is what happened, but I can
Mhm.
tell somehow they're not quite getting to what's really happening yet.
Yeah, or I can tell like if something I've said has kind of triggered someone. There's a little subtle shift, like a I almost feel it like it's a kind of a snapping to a different kind of tension or something, and I can really pick up on that because of, needing to do that when I was young in order to stay safe or out of out of harm's way. But it reminds me of this old kind of poetic and mythological idea that there's a relationship between the wound and the gift. Like Jung said, behind the wound lies the genius. And so we have to kind of go through the wound in order to reveal or retrieve our gift for the world. And so I'm wondering, like, how much of your work and your role as a kind of defender of the earth and all its creatures relates to your difficult early childhood.
I wonder that too. And um and this is one of those things where there's that famous line from the book Virginian, and also the movie, smile when you say that, mister. It's
Hmm.
somebody there's the cowboy, the Virginian, and somebody says, I think somebody calls him a son of a bitch or something. And he says, smile when you say that, partner, or something along those lines. And I've had people, and don't worry, I'm not saying you're doing this, but I've had people say to me, "Oh gosh, Derrick doesn't really care about the salmon. He's just mad at his father, and he doesn't care
Oh yeah,
about, sort of the projection."
kind of
And
dumb
so,
Freudianism. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And my response to that was always, I would still be upset at the death of the salmon, even if my father were perfect. My father has no relationship to the salmon. But on the other hand,
Hmm.
I mean, it's undeniable that there's been I mean, that's another thing is that so it's undeniable that there's been influence that no, it's undeniable that I have become sensitized to some things that I might not have been sensitized to. And Judith Herman talks about this. She says that people who've been through trauma, they're never the same. They're that's one of the things I say in the last chapter is that
Mm,
when you go through profound trauma, you can never go back, because the life that you had before is over. And if you had the trauma when you were a child, the life that you would have had is gone forever. But you have a different life.
hmm.
And it's no different than I stopped a dog fight a couple months ago, not mine, it was
Oof.
somebody else's dogs. I stopped a dog fight and it doesn't hurt. It's all fine. But my pinky is different for the rest of my
Yeah.
life. And by the way, I was really freaking out about it. And I went to a orthopedist and he calmed me very much by showing me that his middle finger looked like that. And he said, "Look, I'm an orthopedic surgeon. I broke my finger in college. It looks weird, but it still works." So I was like, "Okay, we're great." Anyway, the point is, well, that kind of works for the other thing, right? That works for the trauma. It's like, yeah, I'm kind of deformed, but hey, it still works.
Yeah.
And
Well, the trauma has shaped you
yeah,
in some way. And like you were saying, like, well, in reading that, the first pages of the book, something survived, but something didn't. And you have no idea who you could have been without that, those
yep,
events.
yep.
And so here you are. And so what are you going to do with your kind of misshapenness or your, the particular shape that you take because of what happened?
Exactly. And I think that yeah, and I love that you just said that. That's, you just summarized the 600-page book in one sentence, which is why my books are 600 pages. Um,
Hey, I want to take a moment to speak with you about this channel. Currently, only 11% of viewers are subscribed to the channel. I think those numbers are terrible. So, if you're enjoying this content and you want to help out the channel, please take a moment right now to like this video and subscribe. And if you really want to help out the channel, you can become a member of the Howl in the Wilderness Patreon, which will give you access to early release of full ad-free episodes, plus access to the archive of the first 100 episodes of this podcast. It would really help me out and allow me to keep creating content like the interview that you're watching right now. Okay, thanks so much. Now, back to the interview. Well,
yeah, that's really it. I started to say what Judith Herman said about it, that she talked about how you can't ignore trauma, you can't ignore it away, you can't and you don't transcend it,
you
but what
can't
you
leave
can
it
do,
behind,
you
right?
can't leave it
Which,
behind. But a lot of people, she said, who've been through trauma become more fiercely protective and more clear about the things they do and don't want in their lives,
mm,
and become fiercely protective of the things they do want.
hmm.
There's a line from there that always brings tears to my eyes, which is some woman saying, um, I will live in terror every day for the rest of my life, but I am okay.
Hmm.
And um,
What I
yeah,
what I hear in that is emphasis on the I. Like there's some deeper part of me that is okay.
well, and this is really, thank you for that. And that's really important too, that that's, the metaphor of the box goes all the way through. And one of the reasons I do is that there, one of the things with perpetrators of abuse is that they, for reasons of their own, probably often having to do with prior abuse,
Mm,
want to get access to everything. They want to control everything. And they want to get access to all those parts of yourself. So it's really important for uh, and well, it's really important for people to try to have something that they keep for themselves,
hmm.
something that is not violated by the perpetrator or perpetrators.
Hmm.
And it's
Yeah.
it's it's pretty miraculous when you think about it, that how smart our bodies are and how smart our beings are, because some part of us as children knows this, and we instinctively create that shell. Like I said in the early part, there's a mule who can stand there and take everything. And that mule was the one who was getting hurt so that the eye could could get not hurt, could
Hmm.
remain unviolated. And that uh I just I sometimes just sort of sit and marvel at the brilliance of, a 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 year old who, you know, there are many there are many things we don't know and don't understand at 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 and 8, but somewhere inside of us we knew that we had to create that we had to protect that part. It's kind
Hmm.
of like instinctively, if somebody gets knocked to the ground, we instinctively get into a fetal position to protect our abdomen, to protect our soft belly.
Yeah.
And I think it's the same sort of thing that we instinct, and that doesn't take training. Anybody knows, anybody's born with that. And I think it's the same thing that we do the same thing psychologically or spiritually. We just uh, know that there's something in there that needs to be protected.
Yeah. I mean, because we carry with us um, a kind of ancestral intelligence that's, tens of thousands of years old. It's like Carl Jung called it the million-year-old person inside. And it's that part of us that knows exactly how to protect, how to survive. Um, you know, the box metaphor is really interesting because yeah, the box can be a place of protection, but like what you're touching on when you're describing it, like what's in the box is also a box of wonders. Like when I retreated from my surroundings, there was music, there was fantasy books, I look back and I realize all of the books that really affected me when I was a little kid were all books about going to another world, like a magical place, like the Narnia books.
Oh, the Narnia books were so important to me as a kid.
Hmm, yeah.
Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I mean, it was just such a kind of fantasy that I could like leave this reality, go to another world that was full of magic and wonder, and I think above all, kind of cosmic justice. Like those books always had that element, like the good always won out. And I think I needed that as like a nutrient or something when I was a kid.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing is that to this day, I read a lot about death penalty cases.
Hmm.
And some of my friends are like, well, that's kind of morbid, that's kind of weird. And then one person I didn't know. I'm just interested in them. I didn't know why. And then one friend articulated it perfectly, which is, oh gosh, this makes so much sense. Derek just wants to know that sometimes bad people get what's coming to them.
Hmm.
Like, huh, bad people get some justice. Because I mean, nothing ever happened to my father. There was no resolution. And it never that never occurred to me. When he said it, it's like, oh, yeah, it makes sense. That's one
Hmm.
reason I'm fascinated by those cases.
Well,
Go
I
ahead.
think often in the case of like, trauma and abuse that's passed down from, you know, parent to child, father to son, somebody pays the cost that's not necessarily the perpetrator, right? It's like that idea that some generations will pay for the sins of the father and all of
Yeah.
that. And so at some point I find, for me, like in my counseling work, I noticed this pattern that it's usually like third generation. Somebody in the family unit wakes up and goes, wait a minute, this is wrong. This has got to stop. And they're the ones who go on the healing journey. And it just seems to be some kind of like natural pattern that occurs. I don't know how if that resonates with you, but at some point you woke up to it, I guess, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Or it's not just normal anymore.
Yeah. And I think that denormalization is really important. I think that, well, the denormalization is almost everything. You have to realize that this is not. everything there is, that there is another way to be. That's one part of it. And another part I think is really interesting with what you're saying is that uh, one of the things that Peggy Reeves Sanday talks about is that one of the markers of a high rate culture can be some sort of significant, excuse me, cultural trauma within the past several generations. That if there was a huge uh, ecological disaster, or if there's a huge migration, or if there's an invasion, that can ramify. And it's the process, getting over that is the process that you just mentioned, that it takes several generations to calm back down. And
Mm.
I love that you said the thing about the sins of the fathers. That's one of my uh, favorite images, or one of my go-to images or go-to lines for thinking about how trauma propagates through 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 generations. And I used to teach at a supermax prison for a couple of years,
Mm.
and a
Wait,
lot
what
of
were
my
you teaching writing?
yeah, creative writing,
Mm.
and a lot of my students, I mean, they had done horrible things, and they, I'm not saying that they shouldn't have been in prison, but a lot of my students, honestly, the people who should have been in prison were their parents and grandparents,
Right, yeah.
because uh, so many. I mean, they had stories that would make yours and mine seem like
Mm.
father knows best, or some sort of Brady Bunch, or some idealistic situation. And I mean, I had one student who was put out to prostitution at the age of 4 by his grandfather.
Mm.
Um, Another one who was on the streets, living on the streets with nothing except his brother at the age of 6. How do you survive that?
Mm.
And just stories of just that were just horrifying. And that's another interesting thing, is that we always hear that child abusers and pedophiles physical child abusers and child sexual abusers have a difficult time in prison. And we never actually collectively talk about why that is. And the students I had who talked about it were incredibly articulate about it. They would say, yeah, we know exactly why we're in prison. And we made terrible choices, but we know what started us on this path. And it was, my father raping me, or my grandfather raping me, or something. It's so they're spending the rest of their lives in prison, and they understand it was because of child abuse. It's not an abstract thing to the ones who talk to me, at least,
Mhm.
which I found really pretty fascinating.
Yeah, so but why do they have a hard time in prison? You
Oh,
s-
because the other people beat them up or kill
Yeah,
them. The
but do you think that's a matter of like child abuse or pedophilia is like the most taboo thing in our culture? So no matter what I've done, murder, rape of an adult woman, I can still look at that guy and cast like a moral judgment on him because he's the worst of the worst. Is it something like that?
it may or may not be, but the only thing I know is what the students who said anything about it or wrote anything about it would say, which is, we know that people like this set us on this path
Mm.
of making terrible decisions that led to, me killing somebody when I was 21.
Mm.
And one of them said he wrote a letter to his family, uh, quote, explaining why I was always so mean, and it had to do with his grandfather beating him.
Mm.
Um, so I mean, you may be correct, but all I can go by is what they said.
Mhm. Yeah. Um, how did you find like What was the therapeutic value of some of that creative writing you were doing? Like, I'm thinking about like a narrative psychology, like rewriting your story, or like the Jungian idea of finding out what your personal myth is, like finding like a larger context for the story of your life, or seeing it from a different perspective that's not solely as the victim, or someone being controlled, or was there some aspect of that in the workshops that you were doing?
Oh, not for my students. I was as a writing teacher, I I recognize that a lot of people write about things that are therapeutic to them. But I'm explicit about this that it's kind of like being a surgeon that uh, I will say, gosh, it sounds like you had a really difficult childhood. Okay, so the second paragraph was really good, and the third paragraph was really good. Can you make a bridge between them that's just as good as those? I immediately moved to technical stuff because I again fully recognize that writing can be and often is therapeutic, but as a writing teacher, again I feel kind of like a surgeon, but that I my job is to be technical, and
Mm.
I don't. I mean, there are often people, I teach online writing classes now, and there are often people who start crying when they read something, and heck, I start crying when I read something sometimes, or when I read when I hear their stuff or when I read stuff. But then it was really I was taught to be a teacher before I was a teacher at a university. Uh, I was taught very much by my supervisor that I was to keep my philosophy. I could put my philosophy and my politics into class, but I was to keep all judgment of that out of my students' papers. So he said, and he of course would get fired today, but he was a great supervisor. He said, if somebody writes something that is offensive to you, your job is to help them write it better. Your job is
Mm.
not to change their politics. Um, and I really appreciated that. And I try to do the same thing today and work with. So in and I want to be clear that I think that there is a hugely important role for therapy, and there's a hugely important therapeutic part of writing, but that's not my job. And it wasn't my job for the and another thing about the thing with my students to prison is that so many of them had been through so much and their lives were so difficult and had been that uh, I think it would have been uh, inappropriate for me to be breezing in for 2.5 hours a week and then just leaving them to their stuff. It would, I mean,
Mm.
so much stuff that I did in therapy was pretty wrenching and pretty hard to deal with. And I was there volunteer. And frankly, most of my students to prison, they came to the writing classes because it was a chance to get out of the cell for a couple hours. So I
Right.
was not going to touch on the deeper issues. Besides which, I'm not. I don't feel myself competent to like if something really started to happen. It's like, oh, what did I just do? I wouldn't have the training or skill set.
Sure. Yeah. But for yourself, you're writing about deeply personal subjects. And like you mentioned when you're writing Language Older Than Words, how it brought up a lot of stuff as you're writing it. A lot of the symptoms came back.
A lot of the symptoms got much worse. Writing a language older than words was
Well,
horrible.
yeah, because I think because you're bringing things to the surface in a way, right? Like the bringing the poison up and like, oh, there it is.
Yeah, so it I was I've always had insomnia, but I wrote that whole book like I'd have night terrors. I couldn't get to sleep until 6 or 7 in the morning, and then I would sleep for like 3 hours, basically drifting. It was all the symptoms got much worse, and uh, I was I had never before experienced hypnagogic illusions, and I didn't even know what they were. I thought I was going crazy because I started having these. Uh, so as a can you define hypnagogic illusion any better than I can? I would probably muddle it. Do you?
I mean, I always just think of the hypnagogic state as, you've got one foot in the waking world, one foot in the dream world. And so the lines between what's real, what's imaginal are completely blurred. And yeah, so you're in it.
But like,
They're kind of, it's like being on a psychedelic journey in a way, like you're awake while dreaming, kind of.
and they were absolutely terrifying. They weren't nice at all.
Yeah.
And I hadn't really had those before. I mean, I've always had an active dream life. I wrote a whole book called Dreams.
Mm,
I love dreams. And, but nonetheless, I never had those. And it's like my eyes are open and I'm seeing just this horrible stuff. Like, and so I went to my therapist and was like, I think I'm going crazy. He's like, it's just hypnagogic illusions. Don't worry, this happens. Anyway, everything became
mhm,
worse. And it stayed worse until probably about 6 months after I was done. And then it didn't stop all of a sudden. It sort of, it got way worse and then stayed there for a couple months and then started drifting down. And then by a year after, oh gosh, I don't know, I can't name a percentage, but a lot, probably most of my worst symptoms were gone. It was so profoundly important for me to make meaning of that trauma and to use the cliche to tell the trauma story.
mhm.
And it's really interesting too that I know this is a bit teleological, but I it's so interesting to think about a lot of uh you can correct my word here, but aberrant behaviors, maladaptive behaviors, behaviors that are no longer adaptive as attempts to tell the trauma story.
Right. Yeah, yeah.
It's just it's so many of my behaviors that didn't really make any sense in my 20s are like, oh, the story was trying to get out. And then once the story got told, it's like, okay, we've been heard. We no longer need to do. And of course, now that I say that, I can't think of any specific examples, but
Mhm.
it's
Yeah, well, it's something, I think when you work with people, when you do your own work, you notice that these recurring patterns happen usually, in a relationship, let's say, like you choose the same kind of person who's not really good for you. And like my perspective on that is that the soul's trying to do the healing work. So it's presenting you with that situation again and again and again until you like find the lesson in it. I think is the way that we heal. Like you said, we make meaning of it. Not that it ever goes away, uh, but it somehow the trauma becomes like redeemed by the meaning that we find in it.
so that okay. Some of the many of the women I dated through my 20s and 30s were very, very nice. Were wonderful human beings. And we just didn't work out for this or that reason. And some of them, there was a time when I dated like four or five in a row who were actually not very nice to me and were emotionally not good for me or emotionally abusive, whatever word we want to use. And after the first one, it's like, wow, that was a bad choice or something. And the second one's like, wow, that was another bad choice. The third one's like, okay, wait a second. I think this is not just bad luck. I think I'm doing something wrong. And it was what you said. I mean, I kept making that. And where I eventually came to, for me, I realized that, there are stories about alcoholics like Peter O'Toole who quit drinking and then could still go into bars because he liked the culture. And then there are other alcoholics who can't go into a bar because that the temptation would be too much. And I've known so many in my life, I've known a lot of addicts who like can't be around the drugs because if they were on the table, they would use them no matter what the cost. And for me, I realized that one of the problems I had is that I was addicted to taking the other person's perspective in a disagreement. And that
Hmm.
can be this is the downside of that thing we were talking about earlier about being able to read people, is that so if somebody did something that was just objectively outrageous to me, within, I don't know, 6 hours, I would have their behavior fully rationalized and it was all my fault. And I I was terrible for having done whatever it was I did that caused them to. And so with that realization, I realized that. And then a couple of years later, I I made one of the smartest decisions in my life, which is I have a one strike you're out policy now on people being mean to me. And people, we all say stupid things once in a while. That's I'm not talking about that. Nobody has to walk on eggshells, but there's a difference between accidentally saying something offensive and intentionally doing something that is causes pain to another.
Yeah.
And I fully claim this. It's not that there's something wrong with the other person. It's just
You're
I
extra
can't have it in my
sensitive to
life.
it. Yeah.
And I have to. It's like that all the old jokes about, when you set up boundaries, when you first do it, you put them way out too far and you make them way too strong, or you make them way too weak and way too strong and way too weak at the same time. So it's like, you put up with all this crap and then somebody does one little tiny thing, steps 1 inch too close to your foot, and you're like, "Ugh."
Yeah. You're out. You're on the other side of the wall. Yeah. Hmm.
And I realized that for me, just the best way to go is uh if somebody is capital M. I don't know how to. I just know it when I see it. I don't know how to define it. But when somebody is
Mm.
again, this is not. I've certainly had disagreements with people, and that's all great. Disagreements are great. It'd be like, if you and I are having a disagreement, that's all fine. But if all of a sudden I start in the middle of the disagreement, I start using some incredibly unfair tactics, like putting you in double binds or pretending you said something. Oh, I know something that might be kind of fun to mention. There's something I developed that I put into the in the boy in the box, which I call the abuse game or the abuse model.
Oh, that sounds
And it's
fun.
really, yeah, it is fun. It's really simple. And the way it works is one person is going to be the abuser, and one person is going to be the other person. And the other person, their goal in this game is to try to come up with something, any statement over which the other person can't pick a fight.
Mm.
So I might say to you, you look really good today. And if you were being the abuser, you could go, today, today I look good, as opposed to every other day when I look like crap. That's what you're saying. You're saying most of the days I look
I
like
get you.
crap,
Mm.
but today, or I say, you're really smart. It's like, oh, so I'm an egghead. So I have no emotions. That's what you're saying to me. And then, so the day I developed this, I was talking to a friend of mine and we were having a great time because it's a game. It's not, we're not really doing it. And I said, come on, you can come up with something that I can't pick a fight about. And she said, you're perfect. I'm like, you win. I can't. And then it hit me. It's like, how hard it is when you always put me on a pedestal? You know how hard it is to be perfect all the time? I'm not allowed to do anything, am I? I can't make a mistake. That's what you're saying. And we just both burst out laughing.
Mm.
And the reason we're laughing is because we both experienced this before. That this is just, I tried explaining this model to somebody who had been profoundly traumatized, and I didn't know. And God, the look on her face when I started explaining it to her, she thought it was real. And it's like, okay, we're backing off.
Yeah.
This is a model. I'm explaining a model. This is not actually happening. But the point is that that's the sort of thing. Like if somebody picks fights with me, it's fine. If you want to fight with me over something, that's great. I don't mind that. But if you pick a fight with me over the using the abuse game, it's like that's where I'm saying I can only do it. You get one chance. And then
Mm.
if somebody does that, like, sorry, I can't. And it really is me. It's not you. I can't be in a relationship with somebody who does that.
Hey, I want to take a moment to speak with you about this channel. Currently, only 11% of viewers are subscribed to the channel. I think those numbers are terrible. So if you're enjoying this content and you want to help out the channel, please take a moment right now to like this video and subscribe. And if you really want to help out the channel, you can become a member of the Howl in the Wilderness Patreon, which will give you access to early release of full ad-free episodes, plus access to the archive of the first 100 episodes of this podcast. It would really help me out and allow me to keep creating content like the interview that you're watching right now. Okay, thanks so much. Now, back to the interview. Yeah. Yeah, it's your capacity to tolerate certain things, and it's like how close are they to the wound? And of course, the closer they are to your personal wound, the more sensitive you're going to be, and the less tolerance you're going to have, right? And so that's about knowing your own personal limitations and then establishing boundaries around that. That to me seems healthy, and it doesn't expect you to that it's your problem that you have this limited tolerance around that thing, and that it's your job actually to transcend that and expand your boundaries and capacities and all of that. But like just honestly saying, like, this is a sensitive spot for me. That seems actually to respect your own woundedness and also to respect the other person, to let them know where the boundary is so they don't keep stepping in it, you know?
Um, yes, I agree with that. And also, um, even without woundedness, uh, life is too short to deal with people who are going to pick fights over nothing.
Oh, I agree, man. Yeah, totally. Well, it's like that thing Judith Herman said, right? You know better like what you want in your life and what you don't want in your life. Like those lines become like really in high relief, like
Right.
really clear. Yeah. And I guess the healing part of it is being able to stand up for that and to voice that rather than just keep taking shit from people.
And also, I think for me, and this just goes back to my therapy in my 30s, a lot of it is the is having the choice. It's like
Hmm.
when I was younger, I just got to put up with this. And now it's like, I can make a conscious choice as to whether I keep you in my life or not. And, it's I know that this is awfully marginal cost, marginal return. But I've always been also really influenced by what Dear Abby or Ann Landers, whichever one, said back in the 70s is the most important, or one of the most important questions in a relationship or the basic question of relationship is better in than out. And am I better off in this relationship or am I better off out of this relationship? And like I said, it's a bit economic, but
Hmm.
it still, I think, is a really important question. And I think it's one that applies, across the board. Am I better off in this job or out of this job? Am I better off? It's provided a nice,
Hmm.
easy way. So is this relationship,
Can,
am I actually better off in this relationship or am I not better off?
can Can we maybe just play with revising that so that I mean, it just sounds so individualistic to me. So I wonder, like, maybe a better
That's true
question
for the
is
other
like,
person too. I'm sorry, go ahead.
well, is yeah, is everyone better off with this relationship intact? Like the two people involved in the relationship, but what about the world too? Like the family, the world, the community. Is this relationship good for the world?
Okay, I hear you and I agree with you. And I want to put in a caveat that um there that when people are, to use the sort of buzzword, codependent, then it can be really easy to stay for the kids or to stay for other reasons. The it's I agree with you. I also believe that one of the primary uses that many of us, myself often included, use for our intelligence is to rationalize whatever decisions we're going to make. And it becomes really difficult because one of the reasons that my mother stayed with my father is because there weren't battered women's shelters in the 50s and 60s. And she had three kids by the time she's 21 or 20.
Mm.
And that's the 1950s. How is she going to survive? There's all those questions, religion, all that stuff. That's all true. But she also, and also family courts were not particularly friendly to women in the 50s and 60s. And my father was wealthy. And so my mother later said that one of the reasons she stayed with my father was I was the youngest by 8 or 9 years. And one of the reasons she stayed with my father is she wanted to stay till I was 9 or 10. And then I would be old enough that a judge might listen to me when I said I didn't want to be with him. And I had tremendous resentment against my mother. I mean, we had a great relationship, but there was resentment in it that was resolved when I was about 30, uh, resolved through conversations where why did she stay with him? Why did all of this happen? And one of the things she said in one of our sort of uh, in the conversation where everything got resolved really was she said one of the reasons she stayed is the reason I just said that she wanted me to be old enough. And I turned that back around and I said, so basically my existence was the reason for another 10 years of beatings and rapes for everybody. That you're using me, my existence, to rationalize all that. And what that means is were I not alive, my siblings and you and everybody would not have been getting
Mm.
all this. And her response was to say, do you think there is one day that goes by that I don't regret decisions I made and decisions I didn't make? And also, she said, do you do you know why, even though you got a degree in science and engineering, I never pushed you to take that career, but instead have financially supported you quite often, even though she didn't have much money, financially supported you, helped you out a lot through your 20s when you're calling yourself a writer, but you're not really writing. You haven't written that much. 10 years of calling yourself a writer. Have you ever wondered why I never pushed you? And the reason I never pushed you is because I knew you didn't have a childhood. And if you were to succeed as an adult, whatever succeed means, if you were to become a happy adult, you had to have years to
Mm.
basically compost your childhood. You had to have years to work through it. And I gave you that. And I would have done it for your siblings if they would have accepted it.
Oh.
And so the point is
Well,
that
very
moment,
perceptive. My God, for her to
that
say
moment,
that.
all of my resentment against her disappeared.
Yeah.
I mean, this is literally true. This is not a magic story because you cannot ask anything more of anybody than A, they apologize, and B, they have spent 10 years trying to make everything right without putting it in your face. She never once pushed that until I had pushed her into a corner.
Hmm.
And it's like, okay, great. I get it. But my point is having to do with what you said is that I know for myself that when you are addicted to being a victim, I'm not talking about somebody else. I'm talking about myself here. This is not me pointing fingers and three coming back. This is me pointing all five of them this way. That when you're addicted to being a victim, you will use any excuse you can to continue that. And I think this is true for any addict of any sort. You'll use any excuse you can to continue drinking, to continue, doesn't matter what, consuming, whatever it is. And so, again, I agree with you, completely agree with you. And at the same time, I can see how I would have used that as an excuse to stay in a bad relationship.
Sure. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, this may not be good for me, but it's helping them. It's helping, everybody else. So again, I totally hear you.
Hmm.
And I think that my language, I completely agree. My language was way too individualistic. Dear Abby's, let's blame her. Um, but I still, again, I know for myself just how easy it can be to use any excuse to
Yeah. Right.
Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, totally. And yeah, I think with any of these things, there are no cut and dry answers. You got to have a high level of discernment and know yourself well enough to know like what your tendency might be to use something to like justify staying in and all of that stuff for sure. Yeah, yeah. Um,
Oh, this reminds me of I'm very even tempered generally, and uh, one time my therapist said, "Help, trying to help me uh, to not take the other person's side when something bad's happening." Is he said, "Excuse me, if I ever want to, so I'm fine either way. Can I say the F word?"
oh yeah.
Okay. So the therapist said to me, if you, Derek, ever inside want to say fuck you to somebody in an argument, chances are really good you're being lied to. And he said, I'm saying this to you because I know you. And I was then talking to another friend of mine. I told him about that the next day. And this friend had an issue with anger. And he started laughing and said, that wouldn't work for me because I want to say fuck you to everybody all the time. And
Hmm.
so the point is that yes, it's very individualistic and very, I mean, he knew that my thing was to, oh, what did I love the line by Gail Dines about how patriarchy basically breaks us into two groups. It teaches men to say fuck you and teaches women to say fuck me. And
Hmm.
I would break that down a little bit differently. It teaches perpetrators to say fuck you and it teaches victims to say fuck me.
Yeah.
And um and so anyway, the point I'm just agreeing with you that it is important to be able to discern sort of where you've fallen and to help uh yeah, anyway, to be able to discern where one falls on those categories.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think like knowing your own wounds and knowing what triggers you and how when you're triggered, it totally changes your perception and things like that, right? It's aware self-awareness and it's a difficult journey. It's probably a really long journey. Like, I'm still on it. I still have my blind spots and I'm sure you do too. Um, but
Yeah,
even
and I really think
knowing that you still
uh,
got blind spots is part of it, right?
yeah, yeah. And then I really think that it's, even though I don't have kids, I think that it really is, as you implied or said earlier, it's a multi-generational journey.
Mhm. Does the difficulty of your child have anything to do with you not having kids?
There are multiple reasons I didn't want kids. One of them is that two of which don't have to do with it, and one of which does. One of them is that I knew pretty early on I wanted to be a writer, and writers don't make any money. And it's, I would not have been able to. It's like Terry Tempest Williams says that her books are our children. So I knew that, I mean, there have certainly existed many writers who've had families, and I
But
don't know
often,
that.
often they neglected the family, actually. That's a common story.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and John Steinbeck wrote in some letter to a friend that he questioned whether a writer could quote go all out on a novel and still have a family.
Yeah, right. You got to
It's
devote
a
yourself to the thing.
Yeah. So that was one reason,
Hmm.
and another reason is uh, I loved being an uncle, but it was always delightful that as an uncle, oh,
You get to go home.
as Donald Trump says, Tony was spreading fake news. Tony's a dog.
Tony's your dog. He's getting
Yeah,
the other
Tony's one of
dogs
the dogs.
riled up with his fake news.
It's fake news. Yep. Um,
You're talking about second reason you didn't have kids. You love being an uncle, and there's a thing about
oh,
being an
yeah.
uncle. Yeah.
So second reason that I didn't have kids is because I love being an uncle, but the wonderful thing about being an uncle is when they get into a bad mood, I can send them home.
Yeah.
And so I got all the fun parts. I lived near one of my sisters when her kids were like 2 through 9. So I got all the great parts of having kids, rubber band fights, water balloon fights, teaching them to play certain games, teach
Hmm.
concentration, all that fun stuff. And they start crying. It's like, can I send her home?
Hmm.
Um, so that was the second reason. And the third reason is that this is four reasons. So the next reason is just there. I've been concerned about overpopulation since I was a kid, and I just didn't want to bring another human on the planet. Um,
Was
I
it also
recognize
like
that
was it also like the state of the planet, like or society in general? Was that part of that?
I just didn't want to add. I just didn't want to add a human. It's a small thing, and it doesn't I mean personal change doesn't equal social change. Obviously, there were I don't know how many people there were 4 billion people on the planet at the time or something, or however many, and there's 8 billion now. So my choice did not make any difference whatsoever.
Yeah.
But and then the other reason was uh, I saw this public service advertisement when I was a kid about it had I don't think it had the effect it was supposed to have or something. It it was an ad about what percentage of children who were abused end up abusing their children, and it was aimed at adults. Like, look, if you abuse your kids, you could turn your kids into abusers. Fine ad. I'm not complaining about the ad. But me seeing that when I was 7 or 8 is like, I never want to do this to another human being.
Mm.
So, I mean, that was a great choice. Um, but part of the effects is I don't want to have kids because I don't want to have kids because I don't want that possibility. Um,
Mm.
and like I said, I haven't actually hit anybody since 8th grade, so it wasn't a real possibility anyway.
Hmm. Yeah.
But that got it from the beginning.
Is that Tony?
No, this one is either Spot or Fox, or actually Dr. Spot or Dr. Fox, because he has this absolute gift for if any other dog is injured, or also me, if I get any sort of injury, he goes right to it and starts licking it. And he
Hmm.
does this for the other three dogs. So I sometimes call him Doctor.
The Greek deity Asclepius.
Mhm.
Yeah, he always had a dog companion, and sometimes people, when they'd go into incubation, if they had a dream where the dog came and licked the wounded body part, it would heal them.
I had no idea about that part. That's
Yeah,
pretty
that's
cool.
why I've got an affinity for dogs too, and Asclepius is like, I don't know, one of my patron deities, I suppose, because I also had a really vivid dream life and continue to work with dreams, and so yeah, he's on my altar, Asclepius, and I like that
Cool.
he's a dog guy, you know. I know we got to wrap up. Thanks so much for going over time with me.
Oh yeah, it's
I
fun.
just I wanted to finish like you posted the last few pages of the Boy in the Box book on your website, and there's a question that I guess you get a lot, and I can understand why. But people wondering like, what can I do about the degradation of the planet and the climate crisis and all of that? And you answer their question by asking them three questions. I thought that would be a nice way to end this because part of what I do on the podcast is voice my troubles. And people who are also troubled about the state of the world find some, I guess, maybe comfort that they're not alone in being troubled by what's going on. But there's always that question like, is there anything we can do? How do we not fall into apathy and despair? And I liked your answers actually because the answers are questions themselves, which I think is helpful. Do you remember them, or do you want me to read them and you maybe talk about them?
Um, I'm gonna try to remember them. Uh, but
What do
before
you,
I do that, I
yeah.
want to mention I think one of the smartest decisions I ever made in my life, which is in my 20s. It has to do with your question. In my 20s, I I recognized that things were really messed up and that the world's getting killed and the problems are so big and I didn't know what to do, so I didn't do anything. Like,
Hmm.
and then one day I realized I wasn't paying enough for gas. And what I mean by that is that what I pay for gas doesn't cover the ecological and social costs. So I decided that for every dollar I spent on gas, I would give a dollar to an environmental organization, a local one, not a national one. I knew that at the time, even. And the problem is, I didn't have any money, so it didn't work. And at the time, gas was really cheap still. So it would, if I fill the tank once a week, that's $10 a week. So what I decided to do is if I didn't have the money, I would pay myself $5 an hour to do activism. And so if I spend $10, that means this week I got to do 2 hours of activism. And I started off by writing letters to the editor. And I was so scared that I would use fake names because it's too scary to put myself out there. And now I write books. I mean, my point is, I was so scared. I mean, and now, so you can do it. Don't let that fear stop you. And then I went to an anti-circus demo. I didn't know anything about circus. I just know they're bad, like they're bad for animals, but I didn't know why. And I didn't let my ignorance stop me either. I went, I showed up. I didn't even make a sign. I just said, "Hi, I'm here." They handed me a sign, circuses are bad. And then if somebody would say, "Tell me why circuses are bad," I would say, "Talk to this guy. He knows more than I do." I just, so the point here is there's a great line by Florence Nightingale, I think it was, who said, "I attribute my success to the fact that I never gave nor accepted an excuse." And
Hmm.
so the thing is, I would do, if I spent $10, I'm doing 2 hours of activism. No excuses. I don't care if I get sick. I don't care what happens. And then I started doing, like there was a Air Force base there, no nuclear bombs. And then I started doing, I got hooked up with some local environmentalists and they were doing timber sale appeals. They taught me how to do that. And it just rolled on from there. So the point is, the the big distinction is not between those who want to bring everything down and those who don't. The big distinction is those who do something and those who do nothing. So first off, just find what you love. And no matter what you love, it's under assault, probably. That can be like local bookstores are under assault. There was a guy opened a local bookstore here. And so for the 2 or 3 years he was in business, I promised him I would buy one book a month um, to help. I mean, I'm not going to keep him in business, but I'm going to do my little part. Oh, that's another thing I want to bring in is I never write books. I've never written a book in my life. What I do is I write a page, and I can do that because writing a book is too scary. I
Hmm.
can write a page today, I can write a page tomorrow, and in a year I got a book. My great grandma used to say to my mother, and then my mother said to me, a cliche, inch by inch, life's a cinch, hard, yard by yard, life's hard. So just
Great.
that's one thing. Just you can do this. And it's the same with like if somebody's in an abusive situation, you can't if you can't escape today, well, you can accumulate a dollar and then another dollar and you can hide them somewhere and you can, or whatever it is you can do. You can do one little thing and
Hmm.
just do one little thing every day. And in a year, you're all set to go. Anyway, whatever. I'm not giving abused people advice that way because I don't want to get anybody killed or anything. But the point is that no matter what you're doing, okay, so
Inch by
that's
inch. Yeah.
inch by inch. Yeah. So that's the thing I wanted to say to set it up. And then also people ask me all the time what they should do. And the thing is I can't tell you what you should do because I don't know you. I don't know your listeners. I don't know my readers. I don't know what the deal is. And so the first question I asked them, oh, back to the what do you love? It's under assault. It could be bookstores, it could be women in general, it could be children, it um could be red-legged frogs, it could be anything. And
Yeah.
whatever it is, just step up and do. So the first question is what do you love? Um, it can be long form discourse. You know, I
Hmm.
I it is important to me. There are things you can't do in a soundbite. There are things you can't discuss in a soundbite. And so books are kind of dying, attention span is dying, and I think doing an hour and a half interview is really important. I think that we have to have long, slow conversations. Some of the best conversations I've ever had have been on long road trips where you're driving for 12 hours and the other person says something, and then you may drive 5 miles and then you respond. And then 5 more miles, the other person responds. Whereas at home, the first person says one thing, and then we go back to watching the basketball game.
Hmm.
Nothing against watching
Yeah.
basketball games. It's just there's so much other stuff to do. Anyway,
Hmm.
so what do you love? And find what you love and defend your beloved. It's one.
Hmm.
Second one is, um, what do you get off on doing? Um, and by I use the word get off instead of what do you love, because what do you love? I love walks on the beach. I love, staring into the fire in the evening. That's like a personals ad or something. What do you get off on doing? I like it's more earthy. Like I get off on trying to figure out the relationship between perceived entitlement, exploitation, and hatred. It's like I that makes me so happy to try to articulate something. Like right now in the book I'm working on, I'm trying to articulate. My mom went to the MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston and found out that she wasn't operable. But I'm trying to, what's the perfect language to describe the Pathopolis or the Oncopolis, the city of the city of the ill, that is that huge medical institution. And
Hmm.
I've been struggling with the language. And when the language comes just right, I'm going to be so happy. I get off on doing that. It's like one day I was hanging out with this guy who's a wetland specialist. We were working to defend some forest, and he was digging in the soil, and then he'd rub it between his fingertips to tell what color the soil is, and then he would compare it to a chart to see if it's wetland soils. And I'm looking at it, he's doing this. I'm saying, so do you get off on doing this? He's like, oh yeah, this is my second favorite thing to do in the world after playing with my dogs. And I'm like, that's great because I wouldn't actually enjoy this.
Hmm.
Or like I mentioned earlier, the attorney who has a serial monogamy. I helped her write some documents one time. I'm like, I hated it. I hate writing legal stuff. I said, do you get off on doing this? Like, oh yeah, I love writing this. So if you can find what you get off on doing, you'll never get burned out. You
Yeah,
know,
right. It's like
it's
self-motivating. Hmm.
yeah, it's just I'm doing it for fun. I loved when I was in college. I loved high jumping. I would not have loved distance running. I hated distance running. Anything over 400 yards is like, oh my God, I'm going to die. And distance runners loved it. They run for fun. Can you believe that?
Hmm.
It's the same thing. So just find what you get off on doing.
Hmm.
And I mean, I know people who get off on doing spreadsheet stuff, and lots of environmental organizations need people who can do spreadsheets. I can't do a spreadsheet to save my life. And so, whatever and then also find out what your gifts are. What are the gifts that you have? Like I have tried to help environmental organizations by writing press releases, and my press releases are terrible. I am one of the worst. They're awful. I would spend 8 hours writing a press release and hand it to them, and they smile very nicely, and then go, "That's okay, Derrick. I'll write it." And then they write it in 15 minutes, and it's good.
Hmm.
Um, I have a friend who writes all my back cover copy for my books because she's really good at it. I'm terrible at it. So find what your gifts are. What are your gifts, and how can you use them in the service of the larger community?
Hmm.
Uh, and what are the largest, most pressing problems that you can help to solve using the gifts that are unique to you in all the universe?
Hmm.
What are the what are the largest, most pressing problems that you can help to solve using the gifts that are unique to you in all the universe? It's like I saw, and I mentioned this early on in the interview, I saw that nobody else was talking, or not many people. It's not true that nobody, a lot of people, but not enough. We're talking about how civilization, we're not, there weren't enough people talking about how civilization is inherently unsustainable. And there were not people like I saw some writers who were pretty outraged at at there were some female writers who were really outraged about what was happening to women. There were some black writers who were outraged about what was happening to black people. There were American Indian writers outraged about what happens to American Indians. I didn't see any, most of the nature writers were pretty, oh, nature's so beautiful. But none of them are like, damn it, these salmon need to be not driven extinct. We need to stop them from being driven extinct. And I didn't see anybody with that fire. It's like, I can do it. And that's a
Mhm.
great thing. It's just something I really learned from my grandma and from my mom is if you see a problem, I'm not going to say if you see a problem, don't complain about it. My mom loved to complain.
Mhm.
But if you see a problem, go ahead and complain about it and then do something about it.
Yeah.
Um,
Mhm. Yeah. It's maybe a West Coast thing. There's kind of there's a bias against complaint here, like as if we should all pretend that we're living in paradise, that nothing's going wrong, and we're all privileged to live here, which we are. But there are still, things that are going wrong at the governmental level, societal level, all of that. And yeah, I think complaint, yeah, if it's coupled with some kind of action, that yeah,
you
it's
know,
maybe even helpful too, because you start complaining together and you find out, oh wait, you hate that thing too. Okay, good. What are we gonna do?
and it just occurred to me right now that complaining can also be perceived as a type of brainstorming.
Sure,
That
yeah, yeah, yeah,
it's like,
yeah. Oh,
I'm
you
trying
know
to
what I
articulate.
hate?
Yeah, exactly.
Hmm.
Exactly. And you have to have an itch before you can scratch it. And it's the same with writing. Writing is I mean it's a big endeavor, even though you do it page by page, but still I want to go back to what are the gifts that you have, and what are the problems that you can solve with the gifts that are unique to you? It's I don't like mass culture, and in that part of mass culture is popping people, make perceiving people and treating them as cogs in a bigger machine. And when I was younger, I would always get sad if I saw an old person working at a job a teenager could do. And now I understand that sometimes they just want to get out of the house and sometimes they absolutely need the money. But the thing is, I never got sad when I saw an old farmer because that farmer knows that land and they're the only person who could do that. It wasn't the age thing that made me sad. It's that it's the replaceability. And I think everybody has gifts. And this is not just pablum. Everybody has gifts that the world needs. And another thing I always tell young people, I'm gonna have to go in a minute, but one of the things I always tell young people is they'll say, "Gosh, I'm 18 and I don't know what I'm supposed to do." Like, yeah, that's because you're 18.
Yeah.
Your job as an 18-year-old, and from 18 to 30 or something, your job is to figure out what those gifts are and to figure out what you get off on doing and to sort of Joseph Campbell said that he spent his 20s learning how to write. So when he got into his 30s and he had something to say, he would he would know how to write. And it's just sort of the same thing. The 20s, the 20s
Mhm.
are supposed to be from I think for a lot of us at least, a period of muddling, a period of trying to figure out. That was another reason I didn't really want kids, is because I had no idea who I was at 18. Also, I'm a Sagittarius. I didn't want to commit if I would have had a kid, I would have fully committed to raising the kid. I would have done everything right.
Yeah.
But it's like, oh my God, there's a big commitment. I can't even commit to going to dinner tonight. Um,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
anyway, the as a teen and in your 20s, that's your job, is to be trying on different hats and to be figuring out who you are.
Hmm. Hmm.
I
And I
always
think there's
think about
something,
this.
well, there's something
Go
too
ahead.
about like as you muddle through, yeah, I'm really happy that I went through certain apprenticeships when I was younger, like technical skill, like the Joseph Campbell thing, learning how to write so that when you have something to say, you can write it. I think there's a similar thing. So even if you don't know big picture what you're going to do, maybe just start learning a trade or learning some technical skills like that, the how to, like the way that you're teaching writing to those inmates, focusing on the technical aspects. There's something to that.
I think that's hugely important. That's another thing is I got a degree in engineering, and I've been very courageous, frankly, with I was very courageous in my 20s with a lot of my career choices. I was trying to become a writer, but I had a great safety net, which is
Hmm.
at any moment I could have quit everything I was doing and gotten a job as an engineer. And I wanted to quit college when I was in my junior year because I didn't really like it much. And my mom said one of the smartest things ever, which is, do you want to go the rest of your life saying you have 3 years toward a degree in physics, or do you want to go the rest of your life saying you have a degree in physics? And it's brilliant. And so a lot of kids have said to me, gosh, I want to quit school and become a full-time activist. I'm like, well, do whatever you want, but it's much easier to be really courageous when you got a safety net that you can walk out. And of course, that was also at a different time. I graduated with no college debt. So, people today can forget everything I say about that. Anyway,
Yeah.
sorry that I've sort of muddled the ending, but yeah, I think people should find what they love out in the world, and if it's under attack, then defend it. They should find out what they like the get off what you get off on doing. I have friends who, if I say, "What are you doing today?" they'll say, "Oh, I got nothing going on, so I'm going to go hand out leaflets outside Walmart." It's like, you're going to talk to people on purpose? I don't. I mean, they enjoy. I can't imagine, but they enjoy talking to random people.
Hmm.
So people have said to me, Derek, you should be an organizer, but I'm not. It's,
Yeah.
you know, so find what you really enjoy doing and then do it. And then if you get tired of doing it, do something else. And then
Hmm.
the third thing is, what are your gifts? Discover what your gifts are and then use them.
Hmm. Yeah. Give them to the world.
Give them to the world. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. Well, I really appreciate, I mean, it was a kind of a very personal conversation between the two of us, and then, kind of went a little more general or, into advice for young people or activists. But yeah, I'm really grateful that you spent this time with me and that we could open these things up. I think there's some nuggets in there, you know.
Yeah, I think it's great. It's fun.
Yeah.
I'm happy to do it again if you want.
Great. Appreciate that. Well, definitely like when the new book comes out or the latest book or the book waiting to be born when it finally emerges, I'd love to get into it. Yeah, there's a lot more I wanted to ask about, but I think we're good. So thank you so
Okay.
much.
Well, thank you.
Take care, hey. Bye-bye.
Have a great day.